The lamp in the gatehouse window of Wren Hollow had been lit every night for 11 winters, and no one in the parish could quite say why. The old woman who tended it was dead these 4 years, and the young woman who tended it now was not the sort to waste oil on habit. And yet, when the wind came up the valley from the salt marshes and the rooks came in low over the beach avenue, the light in that narrow window was always burning by the time the last of them settled, small and steady and of no obvious use to anyone. Travelers took it for a beacon and were grateful. The parish took it for eccentricity and forgave it. Only one person in the county knew what the lamp was for, and she was not in the habit of explaining herself. It is necessary, before any of this can be understood, to speak of the house behind the gatehouse and of the man who had walked out of it on a June morning 11 summers past and had not, in all those summers, come back. The house was called Amberville, though the county spoke it as if it were a cough, and it stood 2 miles up a beach avenue, whose branches had grown across the road in his absence, and now met overhead in a green tunnel that even at midday was cool. It had been, in its day, one of the great houses of the Middle Shires, with a lake shaped like a leaf and a chapel older than the family, and a rose garden that had once required 6 men. It was now, in the 11th year of that absence, one of the great houses of the Middle Shires still, but on paper only, for the 6 men were down to 1, and the leaf-shaped lake had silted at its stem. And the rose garden was mostly a memory kept alive by a single stubborn bush by the south wall that no one had ever managed to kill. And it is necessary, before either the house or the light can be understood, to say something plainly at the outset, so that the listener may carry it into what follows, and not be tempted to feel more surprise than the story can afford. The man who walked out of Amberville on that June morning was Alaric, 6th Duke of Cansford, 26 years old, half broken by a grief he had not yet consented to name, and the child who was born in the house behind him 7 months later was his. And he did not know it, and would not know it for the length of this story to come. That is the first fact. The second is that the woman who lit the lamp each night knew both facts perfectly well, and had lit it every night for 11 winters, not out of hope, exactly, and not out of grievance, but out of a promise made in a very cold hour to a woman who was dying. And she was not the sort to break a promise merely because the person she had made it to could no longer hold her to it. Her name was Isolde Marnie. She was 27 years old when this story properly begins, though the parish took her for older on account of her carriage and her voice, and the fact that she had, for as long as anyone could remember, said exactly what she meant. She was not the widow of the Duke. She was not, indeed, the widow of anyone the parish had ever met. She had come to Wren Hollow in a farm cart on a February evening when she was 16, with a bundle of linen and a mourning ring on a cord round her neck, and a young girl already gravely ill in her arms, and she had asked at the vicarage for the nearest house that would take in 2 friendless women for honest work, and the vicar had given her the name of the Dowager Duchess, up at Amberville, and had said, with the small dry cough he used when he had done a good thing, and did not wish to be thanked, that she would find there a mistress who paid in kindness what she could not pay in coin. Isolde had thanked him without weeping, which he remembered afterwards, and had walked the 2 miles up the beach avenue with the sick girl on her hip. The sick girl was Cecily. She had been Isolde's oldest friend and was, by then, past the point where friendship could save her, but the Dowager Duchess of Amberville had opened her door to both of them without a question asked, had given Cecily the small yellow bedroom that faced east so that she might have the morning, and had given Isolde a place at the household books and a bunch of keys and, in time, the running of the whole house. Cecily had lingered 2 years in that yellow room, and had died in it in a march that no one at Amberville ever spoke of afterwards. Isolde had washed her friend and dressed her and sat with her one whole night by the coffin, and had come down in the morning and asked the dowager quite steadily whether she might remain and be of use. And the dowager, who was by then very old and knew a great deal about grief and about young women who refused to weep, had said only, "Sit down, my dear, and eat your breakfast. We shall not speak of leaving." Which was the manner of person the dowager was. So Isolde stayed. She ran the house through the last long years of the dowager's life, learned the county families and their weaknesses, learned the tenants and their strengths, learned the accounts as one learns a language one must live in, and answered by letter, twice a year, the same brief and courteous inquiry from a bank in the capital, addressed to whomsoever now held the keys, requesting a plain statement of the estate's condition and requiring no other reply. She wrote back plainly, twice a year, for 11 years. She was thanked twice a year by return of the same clerk's copperplate hand, and in the 11th year of that correspondence, on a wet October morning, she received instead a letter in a hand she had never seen in life, but had seen once, in an old book of accounts, and had never forgotten. And the letter said, in 6 lines, that His Grace was returning to Amberville within the fortnight, and would be obliged if the household were prepared to receive him, and remained, hers respectfully. Cansford and Isolde read the letter twice, and folded it, and put it into the small drawer of the desk where she kept the things she meant to think about later, and went out to the yard to see about a broken hinge on the dairy door, because the dairy door could not wait, and the letter, for the moment, could. That evening, when the boy came in from the beach avenue, with his boots muddied to the knee and his cheeks red from the wind, she took him by the shoulders and looked at him with a steadiness he had known all his life, and understood to mean that a serious matter was to be spoken of, and she told him nothing at all. She said only that his supper was ready, and that he was to wash first and comb his hair, and he did as he was bid, because he was a courteous child by nature, and because he knew that when she chose to tell him a thing, she would tell him, and not before. He was 10 years old that autumn. His name was Thomas. He had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, though only 2 people alive would have known to say so, and one of them was in a churchyard 3 counties away, and the other was on the road home at last. And that was the shape of the household that received the letter, an unmarried woman of 27 who was not a widow, a boy of 10 who was not her son, a lamp that was not for travelers, and a house that had been waiting 11 years without being told exactly what it waited for. To understand why the 6th Duke of Cansford had walked out of his own house at 26 and had not come back for 11 years, one must first understand a marriage of 3 months and a fever of 3 days, and a mother who had made a choice at that fever's bedside that she could neither undo nor confess. Alaric of Cansford had married at 25, a young woman named Rosamond Elliot, of no fortune and less family, whom he had first seen at a shabby music evening in a market town, and had loved on the walk home. His mother, the dowager, had not approved of the match, in the practical way that she disapproved of all matches that would not repair the roof, but she had been fair, as she was in most things, and had received her daughter-in-law with a coolness that thawed within a fortnight into something very like affection. Rosamond was a plain, quick, easily amused woman with a laugh that carried, and she had made the dowager laugh 3 times in the first week, which the dowager had privately regarded as a small miracle, and had, in her private ledger of persons, recorded in Rosamond's favor forever after. There had been talk, briefly, of an old scandal touching Rosamond's mother's side. The dowager had inquired quietly, been satisfied, and closed the subject. And the young duke, 26 and in love, had gone about the house that spring in the manner of a man who has discovered that a thing he had believed only rumored was in fact for sale, and could be his. It lasted, that spring, into a green and improbable summer. And then, in the 3rd month of the marriage, Rosamond had taken a chill on a ride and had been in bed by nightfall and dead by the Thursday, having, on the Wednesday evening, sent for her mother-in-law and, after the door was shut, said something to her that the dowager did not repeat to a living soul for the next 4 years, and that Isolde would only be told at the dowager's own dying, and that Thomas would not be told until this story was very nearly finished. What Rosamond said, in essence, was that she was with child, and that she had not yet told Alaric, and that if she were to die of this fever, which she believed she would, the child was to be preserved, at whatever cost of appearances. But her husband was not to be told until he could bear it, because if he were told at once, in the state he would be in, he would ruin himself out of grief, and would ruin the child with him. "Say nothing," she had said, "until he can hear it." And the dowager, who had held her daughter-in-law's hand and had promised, believed on the Wednesday evening that she was promising a matter of days. She did not know, on the Wednesday evening, that she was promising a matter of years. Alaric had ridden out on the June morning of the funeral, because he could not, he said, remain in a house whose corridors he could not walk without seeing his wife in them. He had said this quietly and with courtesy, and had asked his mother to hold everything for him, and had not, in the 12 hours before he rode, entered the yellow room on the east side of the house, where a physician was quietly attending to a young woman lately of the household, brought in from the vicar as a friendless case. He had not seen the young woman, he had not known that she existed. He had not, if it comes to that, known that his wife had been with child. He had said, at the door, that he would write when he could bear to, and he had ridden south, and had taken ship, and had written 6 months later from a garrison in a hot country, to say that he had bought a commission and was well, and had written thereafter twice a year to his mother, and, when his mother died, twice a year to the bank, and had not, in 11 years, asked after the roof or the roses or anyone under either. It was not cruelty, it was the arithmetic of a man who has decided that he must not touch the sore place, because if he touches it, he will not be able to stop. His mother, who had promised Rosamond silence until he could bear it, had watched him ride and had understood. With the clear and unsparing eye of a woman who had loved her son through his infancies, that he was not going to be able to bear it for a very long time. She had gone up that same evening to the Yellow Room, where Cecily Marne was dying by inches, and Isolde Marne was sitting beside her, unknown and unregarded in the house, and she had made her decision then, standing in the doorway with the lamp in her hand. She would keep her promise. She would preserve the child, at whatever cost of appearances. And she would preserve the young woman at the bedside, too, because the young woman had the steadiness a household needs, and because the household was going to need steadiness of a very particular kind for a very long time. She did not, that night, tell Isolde any of this. She only said, "Come out into the corridor a moment, my dear. There is a small matter I wish to speak to you about, and it may take us all the winter." Amberville, in the 11 years that followed, kept its own counsel. Rosamond's child, a boy, was born in January, in the small room next to the dowager's own, quiet and whole, and, in the manner of the family, gray-eyed. He was baptized privately by the vicar, who had, at the dowager's request, entered nothing into any parish book beyond the plain fact of the christening, and had been thanked in a coin he did not accept, and a friendship he did. He was called Thomas, after no one in particular. The dowager, who could have given him any name in the family Bible, gave him the plainest name she could find, because she was thinking, even then, about a boy who might one day have to be given back a great deal at once and would need a private name of his own to stand behind. And he was raised from that first winter by the dowager and by Isolde in the plain manner of the household, without any lie ever told him that would have to be undone, but without, either, any truth spoken of that could not, at that hour, be born. He knew that his mother had died at his birth. He knew that his father was a soldier who had gone abroad and would come home when his duties allowed. He knew that Isolde was not his mother and did not pretend to be, and was, all the same, the person to whom he ran when he had cut his hand or seen an owl. He was, by the age of 10, a courteous, watchful, uncommonly literal child who took the world at what it plainly told him and did not press it for more. Which, considering what the world had not plainly told him, was as much as anyone could ask. The dowager had lived to see him 7, and had died on a September afternoon with her hand in Isolde's, and had, in the last hour of that afternoon, told Isolde in 6 sentences the whole matter: the promise made, the promise kept, the son abroad, the boy in the schoolroom, and the letter that would one day come. Then she had said, "My dear, I am handing you a debt. You may repay it as you see fit. Only remember that it was owed to a woman who could not stay to collect." And Isolde, who had sat by many deathbeds and had learned that the dying speak plainly and are answered plainly, had said, "I shall remember." And the dowager had shut her eyes and gone. And Isolde had sat by her another hour in the manner she had once sat by Cecily, and had then risen and gone down and set the household in mourning, and had gone that night, for the first time, up to the gatehouse window where the old woman who was the 6th generation of gatekeepers had, until the previous winter, kept a lamp by habit, and had lit the lamp herself, and she had lit it every night since. Not, as has been said, out of hope, exactly, but because when a woman is handed a debt in the last hour of an afternoon, she wishes there to be a light in a window on the road, so that when the debtor comes home he shall not, in the dark, take a wrong turning past his own gate. And now, on this wet October morning, in the 11th year of the lamp, the letter had come. Thomas was 10. Isolde was 27. The dairy hinge was mended. The letter was in the drawer. The parish knew nothing, and would know nothing for a good while yet. And somewhere on a road from the south, a man of 37 was coming home to a house he did not know contained his son, borne along by whatever had at last let him turn his horse northward. A treaty signed, a commission sold, a bad dream cleared, and by the courteous, uninformed conviction that he was returning to an empty house, a housekeeper of decent character, and a duty at last endurable. It is important, before he arrives, that the listener understand that no one in the house was afraid. Exactly, Isolde was not the sort. Thomas did not know enough to be. But everyone in the house had, for 11 years, been standing on a floor that was, in fact, a door, and the door was about to be opened from the far side. Everything that came after began in the hour of that letter, and everything that came after was, in the end, the price of 11 years of a lamp burning in a window for a man who did not know he was expected. To understand the price, one must first understand the debt. He came home on a Thursday, in weather that could not decide itself. The beach avenue was half in mist, half in low sun, and the rooks were behaving as they behave in October, which is to say ill. He came alone but for a single manservant on a second horse, having sent his baggage ahead by carrier from the market town, and he came, as he had left, at a walk, because he had decided some miles back that he would neither hurry nor tarry, that he would look at the place with a clear eye, and that he would not disgrace himself before whatever household remained to receive him, by any visible sign of what the sight of the beach tunnel was doing to his throat. He did quite well at this, all told, until the gatehouse came in sight and he saw, in the narrow window, the small unmoving flame of a lamp lit in daylight and, plainly, forgotten. And he said, quietly, to no one, well, because he had not, in 11 years, expected to find anything at Amberville still lit. Isolde received him in the hall, in her plainest gray dress, which was also her best, with her keys at her waist and her hands quite still at her sides, and Thomas at her elbow, brushed and grave. She had thought, in the hour before the horse was heard, of a great many things she might say, and had discarded them all. She said, in the end, only what any housekeeper of any decent house would say, which was, "Welcome home, Your Grace. The rooms are ready." And then, because she had spent 11 years telling the truth in small, useful quantities, she added, "This is Thomas. He has grown up in the house. The dowager wished him presented to you at once, when the moment came." And she stepped back a half pace, and Thomas made his bow, precisely as he had been taught, and looked up at the tall, gray-eyed man in the wet cloak, with the frank and unafraid attention of a boy who has been told a soldier is coming home and expects a soldier. Alaric of Cansford looked down at the child, and for the length of one long, badly managed breath he did not know what he was seeing. He saw a boy of 10 with his mother's set of the mouth, if he had had eyes to see it, and his own hands, if he had had eyes to see them, holding a cap in the exact manner in which he himself, at 10, had been taught to hold a cap in this same hall by a father who had died the following spring. But he had not eyes to see any of this, because he had been 11 years abroad in the business of not remembering, and had trained himself very thoroughly at it, and because a boy in a country house is not, at first sight, a riddle, a boy in a country house is a boy. And so he said, quite courteously, "Well met, Thomas," and to Isolde he said, "Thank you, madam, for taking the trouble to bring him down." "Are you the housekeeper?" And Isolde said, "I am. My name is Isolde Marne." And he said, "Then I am much obliged to you, Miss Marne, for the state of the hall, which I had feared to find worse." And she inclined her head, and the moment passed, and the manservant took his cloak, and the fire in the great hall, which had been laid 3 days and lit only at the sound of the horse, did what fires do in old houses that have been cold a long time, which is to say, it went about its business with a small offended crackle, and the house at last began to warm. He was, in those first days, not what she had feared and not what she had hoped. He was courteous. He was tired. He walked over the house room by room, silent, touching nothing, and when at the end of the 3rd day he came into the estate office and asked to see the accounts, she gave them to him without a word and stood at the window while he read them. He read them for a long time. She had kept them very plainly for 11 years, in a hand a clerk had once told her was too clear for a woman, which she had taken as a compliment and had never mentioned to him again. He read, and he turned pages, and once he set his finger under a figure and did not lift it for a full minute, and she looked out at the rooks and counted. At the end of the reading he closed the book, and set his hand upon it, and said, "Without looking at her, Miss Marne, I owe you the running of this estate for 11 years. She said, "Your Grace owes me nothing." He said, "That is not the case, and we shall not pretend it is." She said, "Then let us call it a debt of the household, and settle it in the household's terms. There is a roof over the west wing that has waited too long." He almost at this smiled, the beginning of a smile that did not, in the event, finish. It went into her private ledger under the heading of Things to be Watched For. It was the first entry under that heading. It would not, for a considerable time, be the last. He asked on the 4th day in the plainest voice he had about the boy. "Whose son," he said, "is Thomas?" He asked it standing at the window of the estate office with his back to her, which she noted. A man who cannot ask a question to a woman's face is asking it, in fact, of himself. She had known the question was coming, and had known during the 11 years that when it came she would answer it in one of 3 ways, and had known during the 4 days he had been in the house that only one of the 3 would do. She said, "He is your son, Your Grace. His mother was your wife. She died at his birth, in the yellow room on the east side of the house, 7 months after you rode out. Your mother, the dowager, promised her that you should not be told until you could bear it. I promised your mother, at her own death, that I should keep her promise. I have kept it as best I could. I am telling you now because you have come home, and because I do not think a promise made for a man's protection is properly kept once it becomes a wall between him and his child. There it is. You may answer me or not." She had said this quite steadily at his back, and had not raised her voice. And when she had finished, she stood where she was and did not move, because she had learned, sitting by her friend's bed and by the dowager's, that certain kinds of speech require of the speaker afterwards a stillness equal in duration to their utterance. He stood at the window a long time. She counted, because she could not help counting. She counted 11, 12, 13 breaths, and at the 14th he set his hand flat against the glass, and then took it away and turned and looked at her. His eyes were dry. His mouth was not quite steady. He said one word, "Miss Marne, Rosamond." She said, "Yes." He said, "And no one," and did not finish. She said, "No one who could tell you. Your mother could not because she had promised. I could not because I did not know where to send the letter that would not do more harm than it undid. Your son could not because your son does not know." He said, "Does he not?" She said, "No, Your Grace. He believes his father is a soldier abroad who will come home when his duties allow. He is prepared to receive that soldier. He is not, at present, prepared to receive anything more. Perhaps in a little time." He said, "In a little time." "Yes." He set his hand against the glass again, and this time he left it there. And after a while he said, without turning, "Thank you," which is the sort of thing a man says when he cannot say any of the things he means. And she understood him, and did not press him. And after a decent interval she went out of the room and shut the door quietly behind her, and stood in the corridor a moment, and did not weep, and went down to the kitchens to see about the boys' supper, because the boys' supper could not wait, and 11 years, having waited, could wait another evening. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe, so you will not miss what happens next. An arrangement was reached between them in the week that followed, which no document ever recorded, and which both of them, in private, honored as if it had been signed. He was to be, in the eyes of the household and the parish, the returned duke. She was to be, in the eyes of the household and the parish, the housekeeper who had held the estate for him. He would tell Thomas nothing beyond what Thomas already believed until such a moment as Thomas, of his own motion, asked something that required a truer answer. Until then, he would be the soldier come home. He would, in that character, dine with the boy each evening, ride out with him on the near meadows on Saturdays, walk with him along the beach avenue in the afternoons, and when questions were put, answer them with the honesty a soldier can afford. He would not, on any account, present himself in advance of the boy's readiness as anything other. He would, in exchange, tell Isolde plainly and at once whatever he learned of himself in the boy's company, so that she might steer the household accordingly, and he would, in the matter of the estate, defer to her judgment for as long as her judgment continued to be sounder than his, which he suspected would be for some considerable time. It was not, as arrangements go, a warm one. It was very fair. She had said, at the end of setting it out, and you understand, your grace, that I have no claim upon him and no wish to acquire one. I am his mother's friend's friend, and his grandmother's promise, and no more. And he had looked at her for a long moment before he said, Miss Marne, that is not quite all you are. But we shall not, at present, argue about the rest. Which was the first thing he had said to her that could not be recorded in the household book, and which she had, that evening, entered under her private heading, and had underlined once. The old lawyer at Marchwater, a small, tidy, tired man who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others and had none left of his own, was brought up to Amberville in the second week, at Isolde's suggestion, to look into the accounts. He came unwillingly, out of a courtesy he could not refuse, and stayed 3 days at the Duke's request, and left in a state of quiet perturbation, which he did not communicate to the household, but which Isolde read in the set of his shoulders as he took his leave. He had promised to write. He wrote, 4 days later, a letter of 6 sides in his crabbed, careful hand, and the letter said that in the 11 years of the estate's holding there had passed through the London accounts, by a route he could describe, but not, at this hour, fully explain, sums in aggregate not inconsiderable, dispersed to a small firm of factors in the port of Adderley. On receipts signed by the estate's long-standing steward, a man named Crowther, whom his grace would remember as a fixture of the household in the late Duke's time, and whom the Dowager had, in her last years, described in a private letter to himself as devoted. The lawyer added, with the dryness of a man who has been in many houses and heard many devotions, that he had made discreet inquiry in Adderley, and that the small firm of factors did not, so far as he could ascertain, exist, and that he would say no more by letter, but would attend upon his grace at his grace's convenience. And there the letter ended, and was folded, and was put by Isolde into the small drawer of the desk, where she kept the things she meant to think about later, and shown to the Duke on the Sunday evening after Thomas had gone up to bed. He read it twice. He said, at the end of the second reading, Crowther, and she said, Crowther. Yes, the Dowager trusted him to the last, and I had not the standing to question her, and by the time I had the standing, she was gone. He said, and you did not write to me. She said, I wrote to you twice a year, your grace, and told you the state of the estate as I knew it. I did not know the state of a firm that did not exist, and I do not think you would have thanked me, in the second year of your absence, to be sent a suspicion. He said, no, I would not. And then, after a while, he said, we shall not at present tell anyone. And she said, no, we shall not. Not until I am certain what he took, and, more to the point, why? Because a man who takes for greed steals from your purse, and a man who takes for fear steals from your name, and the difference between the two will govern how the matter is closed. I shall know within the month, and when I know, I shall tell you plainly, and we shall decide together what is to be done. And she said, together, without emphasis, as if it were a word she had used in his presence for years, and he heard it as if it were a word he had never in his life been offered before, and neither of them, for the moment, remarked upon it. It went into his private ledger under a heading he had not, until that evening, kept. Autumn thinned into a hard, clear winter, and the household settled by degrees into a rhythm neither of them had planned, and both, without saying so, protected. He rose early and rode out over the frozen fields with the tenant farmer whose family had held the low pasture since his grandfather's day, and came back with mud on his boots and the beginnings of a plan for the drainage that had gone wrong in the 5th year of his absence, and drew it out for her at the kitchen table over a cup of tea while Thomas did his lessons at the other end of the room. He learned the names of every man on the estate within a fortnight and did not, in her hearing, pretend to have remembered them. He asked. He sat with the vicar on Wednesday evenings and heard the parish's small griefs and did not, on any of those evenings, unburden his own. He read to Thomas in the library after supper, plain histories at first because the boy liked plain histories, and then, at the boy's request, poetry, because the boy had discovered poetry in the dowager's book room and wished to know what it was for. And Isolde, coming into the library on those evenings to bring in the tray or to fetch a book, would see the two heads bent over the same page and would go out again as quietly as she had come in, and would stand a moment in the corridor and count her breaths. He performed, in that first winter, a great many small, unwitnessed kindnesses that she was not meant to see and did see. He mended one afternoon in the disused workshop by the stable the little wooden horse Thomas had loved and outgrown and refused to give away. He set it back on the boy's shelf without a word. He walked on a Sunday when the roads were bad, 3 miles to the cottage of the man whose leg had been broken in the harvest, and read him the letter his son had sent from the port, and read it a second time when the old man asked, and left without accepting the small coin the old man tried to press upon him. He carried, one evening at the back door, an armful of firewood in for the scullery maid whose wrist was strained, and set it down and went out again without her seeing who it had been. Only Isolde, coming into the passage with a lamp, saw the tall shape retreating and saw, at the doorpost, the small pile of split wood, neatly stacked, and understood. And in the same weeks, though he did not know it, she performed the same sort of kindnesses in return. She wrote, without telling him, a long, careful letter to the widow of a soldier of his old regiment, whose pension had been withheld, on his behalf and in his name. The pension came within the month, and the widow wrote to him a letter of thanks that he read at breakfast in mild bewilderment and set aside. She sent, without telling him, a pot of the dowager's ointment down to the harvestman's cottage, and told the old man it was from the estate. She sat, without telling him, with old Mrs. Hallow at the parsonage in the last week of Mrs. Hallow's life, and closed her eyes for her at the end, because the vicar was out and could not have borne to be present, and because Mrs. Hallow had once been kind to Cecily. Neither of them, that winter, spoke of any of this to the other. Neither of them, that winter, needed to. They had begun to see each other by their unwitnessed acts, in the way people first begin to know one another in the country, which is not by what they say at table, but by what they leave behind them in rooms they think are empty. Milestones accumulated, in the way of a country winter, small and unremarked at the time, and load-bearing afterwards. There was the evening she was called away from supper by a message from the dairy and, coming back a quarter of an hour later, found the Duke reading aloud to Thomas the passage she had left off at, in her exact place, without ostentation. There was the morning he came into the estate office with a bunch of the last winter jasmine from the south wall and set it in a jar on her desk without comment, and went out again to look at a broken fence. There was the afternoon Thomas fell from the low bough of the beech nearest the gatehouse and cut his hand quite badly, and it was the Duke, not she, whom the boy called for, and the Duke, who had held men's opened arms together under worse circumstances in worse countries, sat on the mounting block with the boy on his knee, and stanched the cut with his own handkerchief, and told him steadily that it was a small wound and would leave a good scar, and did not mention, either then or later, that his own hand had been shaking when he tied the knot. She had come running from the house and stopped at the gate, and had seen the two of them there, and had understood, in the manner one understands a thing one has been half expecting for a great while, that she had been outflanked at last. She said nothing. She walked forward at her ordinary pace, and inspected the hand and pronounced it a small wound, and thanked his grace, and took the boy in to have it dressed. She entered nothing in her private ledger that evening. Some entries do not need making. The heart, in its own way, makes them. And once, in that first winter, on a black evening when the wind was up and the beaches were groaning like a ship in a bad sea, and Thomas was asleep and the household was gone to bed, they sat together in the estate office over the accounts that Crowther had, on paper, kept, and worked their way through them line by line. It was a labor of hours. He read the entries aloud, and she found the ledgers that corresponded, and where the entries did not correspond, she marked the pages, and where a signature was doubtful, she measured it against a signature that was not, and where a receipt referred to a place that did not exist, she set the receipt aside in a small pile that grew, over the course of the evening, into an accusation. Neither of them spoke of anything beyond the work. Once, reaching for the same page, their hands touched at the wrist, and neither drew back at once, and neither remarked upon it. And after a moment she took up the page, and he took up his pen, and the wind outside continued its complaint. At 1 a.m. she set down the last of the receipts, and said, "That is enough, your grace. If we go on, we shall persuade ourselves of things that are not there." He said, "We have persuaded ourselves, this evening, of a great deal that is there." She said, "Yes," he said, Isolde. She looked up. He had not, in 5 months of their arrangement, called her by her given name. He said, "Thank you. For the accounts, and for the boy, and for the lamp in the gatehouse window, which I have not yet asked about, but which I have seen every evening since I came home." And she looked at him steadily and said, "One day, your grace." "I shall tell you what the lamp is for. Not this evening." He said, "No, not this evening." And they gathered the papers and went to bed. And in the gatehouse window, the lamp burned on until the maid extinguished it at dawn, as it had burned every night for 11 winters. Only, that night, for the first winter, it was burning for a man who was under the same roof as the woman who lit it. And neither of them, quite, knew what to do about that yet. Then, in the 3rd week of a hard February, 3 blows fell in 3 days, in the way that in country places blows always fall, one after another, each announcing the next. On the Monday, the old lawyer at Marchwater sent up word that Crowther, having been quietly kept under observation these 3 months at the lawyer's own arrangement, had left Adderley by the mail coach for the north, in company with a woman not his wife, taking with him a small trunk and a letter of credit drawn on a bank in the capital that the lawyer had ascertained would not be honored past the following Tuesday. He had, in short, run. And the lawyer, dry as always, added that a man who runs before he is chased has, in his own mind, condemned himself, and had saved them all a great deal of unpleasantness by doing so. The Duke read the letter at breakfast and passed it across the table to Isolde without a word. She read it and said, "Well, then, we shall not chase him." He said, "No. He will be more punished by being let alone than by anything we could contrive. Let him keep the woman and lose the sleep." And she nodded, and they went on with breakfast, and she thought, watching him butter his bread, that a year ago he would have wished to chase, and that this was one of the small things that had changed in him without either of them naming it, and she was pleased, in a plain private way, and did not remark upon it, On the Tuesday, in the middle of the morning, a carriage arrived at the front door unannounced, and out of it came a woman Isolde had not seen in 11 years and had hoped never to see again, and behind the woman came a young man who was plainly her son. The woman was Lady Estrellin, who had been at school with Rosamond and had detested her cordially for the crime of being loved by a duke, and who had, at Rosamond's funeral, wept in the front pew in a manner that had made the dowager, standing behind her, shut her eyes. She had inherited, on her father's death, a considerable fortune and a small estate 2 counties away, and she had married and been widowed and had produced a son, Marius, who was now 23, and had, so his mother said, expressed a great wish to meet his late aunt's husband, whom he could just remember from a childhood visit. She said this in the drawing room, standing by the fire, in the smiling, well-mannered voice she had used at the funeral, and her eyes as she said it went once round the room and rested on Thomas, who had come in at Isolde's summons to make his bow, and had done so and stood, as he had been taught, at Isolde's elbow. Lady Estrellin looked at Thomas, and looked at the Duke, and looked at Isolde, and smiled again more brightly, and said, "And this is?" And the Duke, before Isolde could speak, said, "This is Thomas. He is my ward. He has grown up in the house." Lady Estrellin's smile did not move by so much as a breath. She said, "Ah, how very good of your grace." And they sat down to tea. She stayed 4 days. She had, she said, not intended to trespass so long upon his grace's hospitality, but the roads were bad, and Marius had taken a slight cold, and the housekeeper at her own house was a fool, and could not be relied upon in her absence. In those 4 days she contrived, with the smiling, well-mannered persistence of a woman who has practiced her weapon for 2 decades, to be alone with the Duke on 6 separate occasions, to require Isolde's presence in the character of housekeeper at each meal, so that Isolde might be seen and dismissed at once as a servant of unusually good manners, to praise Thomas warmly and often, and to add each time that it was so very unusual, was it not, to see a bastard child raised so kindly, and always in exactly that phrasing, and always with her eyes on the Duke, and always with the smile that did not move. She did not say bastard once in Isolde's hearing where the Duke was not present. She saved it for the drawing room, over the sherry where the Duke could hear and Isolde could not intervene. She said it 3 times on the first evening, 4 on the second, and on the third evening, at supper, in Thomas's own hearing, said it a 5th. The boy, who was 10 and courteous, and had been taught what the word meant only 2 years before by a groom whose vocabulary the dowager had personally corrected, went very white and set down his spoon and said, "Madam, I am my father's ward, and I do not know what you mean." And there was a small silence in which the fire was heard to shift, and Lady Estrellin recovered her smile and said, "Oh, my dear child, I mean only that your father is very good." And no one at the table said anything more, and after supper the Duke rose and said, "Quite quietly, madam, the roads have dried. I believe you may safely go tomorrow." And she went, in the morning, with her son, and with her smile, and Isolde stood at the door and watched the carriage down the beach avenue, and did not, aloud, say what she thought. But the blow was struck. On the Wednesday evening, Thomas came to Isolde in the small parlor and said, "Without preface, will you tell me, please, whether I am my father's son or not?" He was 10 years old, and he was steady, and he was very pale, and Isolde looked at him and thought, in one instant, of a great many considerations, and set them all aside, because a boy of 10 who asks a plain question deserves a plain answer, and because she had promised his grandmother that she would tell truths when the moment came for them. She said, "Sit down, Thomas." He sat. She said, "You are your father's son. Your mother was his wife. She died when you were born. Your grandmother wished you to grow up quietly and to know your father only when he was ready to know you. He has been home 5 months. You are ready. He is ready. I ought to have told you when he came, and I did not, because I was afraid of taking anything from either of you that you might one day wish to keep. That was cowardice on my part, and I am sorry for it. There it is. You may answer me or not." And Thomas looked at her a long time, and then said, "Is that why the lamp is in the gatehouse?" And she said, "Yes, in a manner of speaking." He said, "Then you did well." And he stood up and went out of the parlor and up the stairs, and did not come down till morning, and she sat in the parlor and did not weep, and enumerated to herself the composures she had held and the composure she had not, and took quiet pride in the count. In the morning, Thomas came down to breakfast and said good morning to his father in his ordinary voice, and buttered his ordinary toast, and asked to be excused, and went out for a walk in the beech avenue alone. And the Duke looked across the table at Isolde and said, "Softly so." And she said, "Softly so." He would not, however, be permitted to sit with it. On the Friday of that same week there arrived by hand from Lady Australian's house a letter, addressed not to the Duke but to the vicar of Wren Hollow, and copied, with the courtesy of the malicious, to 3 of the county's principal families. In it, Lady Australian regretted to inform the vicar that during her recent stay at Amberville, she had ascertained certain facts touching the parentage of the child at present resident there, which facts she felt obliged, as a Christian and a friend of the late Duchess, to lay before the parish, namely, that the child had been baptized privately, without proper entry in the parish book, at a date when his Grace had been abroad more than half a year, and that the housekeeper who had raised him was a young woman of no known family who had arrived in the parish 2 years before the child's birth in company with another young woman since deceased. She drew no conclusion. She merely, she said, laid the facts before the parish that the parish might consider them, and she remained, sincerely, its friend. And the letter reached the vicar on the Friday morning, and the vicar came up to Amberville that same afternoon and set the copy on the estate office desk in front of the Duke without a word, and stood at the window while the Duke read it. And the Duke read it, and set it down, and looked up, and said, "Very well." On Sunday, she had better come to Sunday service. So had they all. For it was the parish tithe supper on the Sunday following, which by the courtesy of 100 years was held in the great hall at Amberville, whether the Duke was in residence or no, and Lady Australian had, at her departure, accepted with pleasure the standing invitation of her late friend, and had promised to return with her son. And the county's principal families would be there, in accordance with 100 years of custom, whether they had received her copy or no. And on the Sunday evening, at 6:30, the great hall of Amberville was full of people, tenants at the long tables, the vicar and his wife at the near end, the county families at the high end, Lady Australian smiling at the Duke's left hand with Marius silent beside her, Thomas seated between Isolde and the vicar's wife in the middle, where the dowager had always placed the household children, so that they might learn the county without being examined by it, and Isolde in the plainest of her 3 gray dresses, with a small sprig of the winter jasmine at her collar, and her hands, for the first time in the evening, not entirely steady in her lap. The Duke had said to her, in the corridor before they went in, "Only, Miss Marne, stand where you are, and let me manage this." She had said, "Your Grace, I will stand where I am." And she had. And they had gone in. He rose, when the plates had been cleared, in the manner of the master of the house at the tithe supper for 100 years, to give the customary thanks to the tenants for the year's labor. He gave those thanks briefly and plainly, and the tenants applauded, and he waited for the applause to end. And then he said, in the same plain voice, "And now, if the parish will bear with me a further moment, I have a matter of my own to lay before it, and I would rather lay it here, at my own table, in the hearing of my neighbors and my household and my friends, than have it laid for me by letter in a parlor I do not know. I shall say this once, and say it badly, and I ask you to hear the whole of it." And the hall went quiet, and Lady Australin's smile did not move. And he said, "My wife Rosamond, whom some of you knew, died in this house 11 summers ago of a fever taken on a ride. She was with child when she died. Her child was born 7 months later in the yellow room on the east side of the house, and was baptized privately by our good vicar here at my mother's request, and grew up in this house in my absence, in the care of my mother while she lived and of Miss Marne after her, in a household that has never in 11 years told him or the parish anything but the truth about him, save in one particular, which was that his father was named as a soldier abroad. That soldier is myself. That child is Thomas, who sits there. He is my son. He is the heir of this estate. He has been so since the winter of the year I left. I did not know, until Miss Marne told me on the 4th day of my return that he existed. My mother had promised his mother, on her deathbed, that I should not be told until I could bear it, and my mother kept her word. At what cost to herself I have only lately begun to reckon. Miss Marne inherited that promise when my mother died, and kept it as best she could, and broke it, as she was right to, in the hour I came home. I owe her, and my mother, and Rosamond, more than I can pay at this table, and I shall not attempt to pay any of it here. I say this now, in this hall, in your hearing, so that no letter written in any parlor, this county's or another's, shall have the power to say it for me hereafter. My son is my son. He was born in wedlock. He is the heir of Amberville, and any man or woman who wishes, hereafter, to say otherwise, shall say it to my face. There it is. You may answer me or not." He sat down. He did not look at Lady Australin. There was, for perhaps 3 counted seconds, no sound in the hall but the fire. And then the old tenant farmer at the head of the tenants' table, the same whose family had held the low pasture since the Duke's grandfather's day, stood up in his place and said, in his broadest and least polished voice, "Your Grace, the parish hears you." And he sat down again. And after him, one by one, without any planning and in no particular order, the other tenants stood, and each said, "The parish hears you," and each sat down, and then the vicar stood, and said the same, and sat, and then the vicar's wife, who was not in the habit of speaking at table, stood and said, "The parish hears you, and I hear you, and I am glad of it," and sat. And the county families, at the high end, one after another, without meeting Lady Australin's eye, stood and said the same, in the manner in which the county says a thing that is now settled. And Lady Australin sat quite still with her smile, and after a long moment said, in a voice that was audibly held in place by effort, "We are of course delighted, Your Grace." And Marius said nothing at all. And then she rose, and said she was suddenly unwell, and asked to be excused. She was excused. She went out, and Marius after her, and the door shut, and the hall let out one long breath as one body, and Thomas turned his head to Isolde, and looked at her with the small, private, unmistakable beginning of a smile that did not, on this occasion either, quite finish, but was, for the first time, entered by her afterwards as complete. And Isolde looked back at him, and set her hand for one moment over his on the table, and took it away, and turned to the vicar's wife and asked, quite steadily, whether she might have another cup of tea. Afterwards, when the tables had been cleared, and the tenants had gone home and the county families had said what was proper and departed, and Thomas had been sent up to bed a full hour past his usual, and had gone without protest, the Duke came into the estate office and shut the door behind him. Isolde was standing at the window, looking out at the beach avenue, where the last of the carriages was making its way down. She did not turn. He did not cross the room. He stood at the door and said, "Isolde." She said, "Your Grace." He said, "No, Isolde, not this evening." And she turned. He said, "I have loved you, I think, since the 4th day. I did not know it until the evening of the accounts. I have known it every day since, and have kept my mouth shut, because I did not know what you owed to the promise you had kept, and did not wish to lay upon you the labor of refusing me at an hour when you had labor enough. This evening there is no promise left to keep. This evening the parish knows what it needed to know, and my son knows what he needed to know, and you have given both of them, at your own cost, everything you had to give. I have nothing to give you in return except a house which is yours already in all but name, and a son who is more nearly yours than mine, and myself, who am neither an easy man nor a young one, and who is asking you from the door, because I do not trust myself to cross the room, whether you will marry me. There it is, you may answer me or not." She stood at the window and looked at him a long time. She said, "At last, come here." And he came. And she said, "When your mother was dying, she told me she was handing me a debt. I have thought all these 11 years that the debt was owed to her, or to Rosamond, or to the boy. This evening, in the hall, I understood that some part of it was owed to you, and I have this evening paid it in full. I do not, therefore, come to you tonight to discharge a debt. I come to you because I have known since the evening of the accounts that I would rather sit with you over bad receipts on a black night than sit anywhere else on any night, and because when you called me by my name in this room a week ago, I did not, for the first time in 11 years, lock the gatehouse door before I went up to bed. The lamp is not for the road, Your Grace. It has not been for the road since your mother died. It has been for you, and now that you are here, you may put it out yourself, when you choose, or leave it burning, and mean by it whatever we, together, decide it means. Yes, I will marry you. Now sit down, before we say anything else that we shall have to make good on." And he sat down. And they did not, that night, say a great deal else. And in the gatehouse window, that night, the lamp burned as usual until the maid extinguished it at dawn, and in the morning, without any announcement, Isolde went up herself and trimmed it and set it ready for the evening, in the ordinary way. Some habits, once meant, are not to be broken merely because their reason has come home. They are, instead, quietly rededicated and go on. They were married 3 weeks later in the parish church at Wren Hollow on a bright wet March morning by the vicar in the presence of the household, the tenants, and such of the county as had been invited and had come, which was most of them. The ceremony was short. The bride wore her plainest gray dress with the same sprig of winter jasmine at her collar. The boy stood at his father's shoulder in a coat that was new but not new-looking, and the vicar's wife wept quietly in the front pew, in the exact place Lady Estrellin had once wept loudly, and afterwards the tenant farmer who had first stood up at the tithe supper stood up in the churchyard and said, "Your Grace, the parish is very well pleased," and shook the Duke's hand, and shook Isolde's hand, and shook Thomas's hand as if he had been a grown man, which pleased Thomas, who by then was beginning, in the small courteous ways of a boy of 10, to become one. There is not much more to be said of the wedding. The dowager, had she been alive, would have said that any wedding worth attending is over before it is remarked upon, and this one was. Of the others, briefly, Lady Estrellin returned to her own county, and within the year, to another, she was, by the following spring, no longer received at the houses she had once counted her own, having overplayed her hand once too often with a letter to the wrong recipient. And she lived thereafter in a smaller house, with a smaller staff and a smaller smile, and was seen, on the rare occasion she came into a town, to be alone. She was not gloated over. The Duke, on being told once, some years later, that she was in poor health, sent a plain civil letter of inquiry and a small sum toward her physician's fees, which she accepted and did not acknowledge, and Isolde, hearing of it, said only, "That is right," and did not speak of it again. Her son Marius, released at 23 from the labor of being his mother's silence, married a plain, quick, easily amused young woman from the town he had grown up in, and became, in the fullness of time, a decent country lawyer of no particular distinction and no small kindness, and named his first daughter Rosamond, and wrote once to the Duke, when the child was born, a letter of 5 lines that the Duke read twice, and folded and put by. Crowther, the steward, was heard of once more, 3 years afterwards, at a town on the northern coast, and then not again. The old lawyer at Marchwater lived long enough to see the boy come of age and to witness the settlement of the estate upon him, and died the following winter, having, in his last letter to the Duke, apologized for not having lived to draw one more codicil, which the Duke read at his desk and did not answer, because he did not trust his hand. The vicar and his wife lived on at the parsonage into a green old age, and were, on Sunday afternoons for the rest of their lives, expected at Amberville, and not disappointed. The old tenant farmer of the low pasture died in his own bed at 83, having asked for the Duke on the last afternoon, and having said to him, when the Duke came, "Only mind the drainage, sir." And having then, being satisfied, gone, the yellow room on the east side of the house was, at Isolde's suggestion and the Duke's assent, opened once a year on the anniversary of Rosamond's death and aired, and had in it a small bunch of the winter jasmine set on the table, and was on all other days kept shut, and used by no one, because some rooms are best used by not being used. Thomas grew. He went, at 12, to a school his father had chosen with care, and Isolde had approved with reservations. He came home at the holidays taller each time, and once, at 15, brought a friend with him, a shy boy from the north, and Isolde noted at supper that Thomas held the boy's cup for him when the boy's hand shook from tiredness, and did not remark upon it, and entered it in her private ledger, and afterwards told the Duke, who nodded once and said, "Good." He went to the university and did creditably. He came home at 23, having spent 1 year abroad in a country his father had never spoken well of, and having, in that year, formed his own opinion of it, which he laid before his father one evening in the library at length, and which his father heard out, and said at the end, "Well, I was wrong," which was, Isolde said afterwards to the Duke in the corridor, the first time she had heard him say that sentence aloud in 12 years of marriage, and was worth the trip. Thomas married, at 26, a young woman of no fortune and less family, whom he had first seen at a shabby music evening in a market town, and had loved on the walk home, and the Duke, hearing this, laughed once, quite briefly, and said, "Well," and did not oppose the match, and Isolde said only, "Bring her to us, my dear, and let us see." And the young woman came, and was received, and stayed, and was, within a fortnight, dear to both of them. She had a laugh that carried. She made Isolde laugh 3 times in the first week. Isolde entered this, in her private ledger, in a hand that shook only a little, on a page she had, without saying so, kept blank against the day. Of the cost, honestly, Rosamond did not come back. The Dowager did not come back. Cecily did not come back. The 11 years the Duke had spent in the hot country, and the 11 years Isolde had spent lighting a lamp in a window, and the 10 years Thomas had spent believing his father a soldier abroad, these could not be given back to any of them, and no marriage and no epilogue would pretend otherwise. Some doors, once shut, stay shut, and it is one of the labors of a decent life to walk past those doors each day without knocking. There were mornings, into their old age, when the Duke would go out alone at dawn and walk down to the Yellow Room and stand outside it a moment, and go on. There were evenings when Isolde would climb the gatehouse stair alone and stand in the small room with the trimmed lamp and think of the 16-year-old girl who had come up the beach avenue in a farm cart with a bundle of linen and a mourning ring, and of the young woman who had died in the Yellow Room, and of the old woman who had promised at that bedside, and of what the four of them had. Between them, maid of the house, and she would come down and go to bed, and the lamp would burn on, and in the morning she would trim it again. Happiness, they had learned, is not the erasure of loss, it is the daily practice of setting a small light where the losses can, if they wish, come and warm themselves without asking permission, and go again when they are ready. Their own life together after the wedding was of the sort that the parish, having a good short word for such things, called quiet. They ran the estate, together, in the arrangement they had made in the first week, and had never seen reason to alter, save that after the wedding the deferring was done more openly on both sides, and the disagreements more frankly. They kept the roof over the west wing. They mended the drainage. They lost, in the 14th year, one child at birth, and did not have another, and did not, on that account, love each other less. They took Thomas's children, when they came, into the house at every holiday, and were called by them by names of the children's own inventing that no one in the parish was ever told, and that were, in the household, always used. They read together in the library after supper. They walked, in all weathers, down the beach avenue to the gatehouse and back, at the same hour each evening, until neither of them could quite manage the walk, and they took, instead, to sitting in the estate office over a small fire, and reading aloud alternate paragraphs, which they said was better anyway, because it had been how they first learned each other, over receipts on a black night. He called her Isolde in company, and at home, sometimes, quite quietly, dear. And she called him, at home, sometimes, quite quietly, by the name his mother had used, which she had never told him she knew, and which he received each time as if it had been said for the first time. And once a year, on the anniversary of the tithe supper, they gave the tithe supper again, and the old tenant farmer's son, and then his grandson, stood up at the head of the tenant's table and said, "Your Grace, the parish hears you, whether there was anything to be heard that year or not. Because some things, once said in a hall, are said forever, and the parish, having said them, does not intend to let them lapse." The Duke lived to be 74, and died in the library on a warm September afternoon, with a book open on his knee and Isolde in the chair opposite. He had said, an hour before, that the light in the beach avenue was very fine that evening, and had gone back to his book, and had, in the ordinary way, gone. Isolde lived 7 years more, and ran the household in her ordinary way, and taught Thomas's youngest daughter the accounts in the same clear hand a clerk had once told her was too clear for a woman, and died in her own bed in a hard January, with Thomas at one hand and his wife at the other, having said, at the end only, "Mind the lamp, please." And Thomas minded it. And after him, his daughter minded it, and after her, in due course, hers, it is minded still. Not, as Isolde had said long ago, out of hope, exactly, and not out of grievance, but because when a woman has been handed a debt in the last hour of an afternoon, and has spent her life repaying it, and has, in the repaying, been given a life she did not know she was owed. She is not the sort of woman to let the light in the window go out merely because she is no longer there to trim it. She has left it, instead, for whoever comes home next, in whatever weather, on whatever road, believing themselves alone. The lamp in the gatehouse window of Wren Hollow has been lit every night for a great many winters now, and no one in the parish can quite say why. But if you were to ask, and if you were to ask kindly, the person who tends it might tell you that a house is measured not by the doors it keeps shut, but by the small lights it keeps burning for the people it is waiting to forgive, and that whoever you are, and wherever the road has taken you, you are expected, and the door will open, and there will be a place set. That is the whole of it. The rest is only the weather. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.